So there's been a little bit of controversy recently with the Game Award nominations this year. And no, I don't mean the tragedy that is Octopath Traveler 2 being mysteriously absent from practically everything. No, I'm here to discuss last week's issue surrounding the Best Independent Game category, which is right here. Now, if you're not caught up, these are the 5 nominees for the Indie Game Award: Cocoon, Dave the Diver, Dredge, Sea of Stars, and Viewfinder. At a glance, this looks fine, I guess. They are 5 games with generally similar budgets and scales, and I personally haven't played any of them. But are they indie games? As it turns out, this question is a bit of a minefield, because what's indie to you may not be what's indie to me. I guess I'll start with the strictest definition possible. An indie game is one that is made by a team who receives no outside help or funding for any part of its process, be that development or publishing. If we use this definition, then, well, Cocoon cannot be included because it's published by Annapurna Interactive. Similarly, Dredge and Viewfinder both can't be included because, well, Team 17 and Thunderful Publishing are their respective publishers. So I guess that just leaves Dave the Diver and Sea of Stars as our only bastions of the indie gaming community left in our award. But wait just a second. If we take a closer look at Dave the Diver, something weird appears here. It turns out that Mint Rocket is a subsidiary of a major publisher, Nexon Corporation. And, well, Nexon has also stated that this isn't an indie game. So is Dave the Diver an indie game? I guess it's not. Does that mean that within our Game Awards indie game category, that there's only one indie game? Arguably, yes, Sea of Stars would be the only indie game nominated under these conditions. Does that make it the best indie game of the year? No, because under our current definition, there are not one, but 2 different games from the best game of the year category that fit this definition. Baldur's Gate 3 by Larian Studios and Resident Evil 4 by Capcom are both, on the tin at least, developed and published by the same team. Although in Resident Evil 4's case, this is most likely just due to Capcom not properly differentiating their development and publishing teams internally from one another. And no, everybody's favorite example of Nintendo actually would not count because they do differentiate their development teams from their publishing teams. So Nintendo is not indie under this definition. Okay. So we've solved indie games forever. Resident Evil and Baldur's Gate will duke it out for the best indie game of the year, and Sea of Stars will just sit there. What do you mean people just won't accept that? Okay, it seems like people don't like this very easy definition. So I guess we'll have to do this in the exact opposite direction. Let's do this by looking at team size. So for this definition, if the team working on a game is bigger than the smallest ever AAA studio team size, then they aren't indie games anymore. Does that work for you? I mean, it's simple. It ignores the publisher problems. Let's do this. If we remove all of these games from our list, we lose Cocoon, we lose Dave the Diver, Sea of Stars, and Viewfinder, leaving just Dredge as the undisputed best indie game of the year, which I guess just leaves a question of how small was the smallest AAA team if 4 of our 5 games got removed. And at least according to the Guinness Book of World Records, it was 6 people. The team size for the smallest AAA team was 6. So any game that has more than 6 people work on it is not an indie game. Does that work for you guys? Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious from these examples that we can't really use team size either, because it just removes most games and doesn't correlate at all with our previous results. So it's a bad metric as well. And as it turns out, there's not really a good metric that we can use to define an indie game, because if we just want them to not be attached to a big publisher, well, we have to track every single publisher then, and also track how much influence on the game, how much money they give the game, and how involved in the projects they are, which, I mean, from A New Leaf Memories, which we would all agree is probably an indie game, we can see that this level of, well, publisher interference is massive, because this game was originally created by Ironheart Studios, or it was being worked on. But now, today, if we look at it, it's not even out yet. It's been completely shifted to a different development team by the publisher, despite it being an indie game. So what's up with that? If it was truly an independent game, the publisher would have no say over who's working on it. So obviously, we have problems here. Maybe we can just use the case of budget, but that removes any game that raises just a bit too much money. Did you have a good Kickstarter? Well, you're no longer indie. Do you know how to exploit venture capitalists for money? Definitely not indie. Did you have somebody who was just interested in your project and decided to give you some capital to help you along the way? No strings attached. Sorry, mate. You're no longer indie. And with that, it's pretty clear that budget is too a pretty big no-go. And maybe, just maybe, it's a question of style. But if we use style, then it's pretty clear that Square Enix is the best indie publisher and game designer of all time. Now, it's sad to say, but indie games aren't really something that we can just easily distinguish using rules. And to make that clear, I have a few games that I want to talk about. I couldn't find the site for Destiny because Destiny 2 came out and they nuked that site. But here's Destiny. Let's talk about Destiny 1. I know this is Destiny 2. Destiny was a game originally developed by Bungie and published by Activision Studios back in 2014. Is Destiny an indie game? If you said no, well, let's think about it a little bit for a minute. Why is it not indie? For me, my first thought would be, well, they received help from Activision Studios, so it can't be indie. Okay, let's move forward a few years. It's now 2019. Destiny is now both developed and published by Bungie. Is it an indie game now? I mean, I removed the big scary boogeyman, so it should be, right? And obviously most people will still say no to this, but what if I change the game names real quick? What about Roots of Pacha by Sodaden, which released earlier this year? It had a publisher for its launch and everything. Is it an indie game? I mean, Sodaden, just like Bungie, split from their publishers after its launch. Is it an indie game now after that split? And what if we do this in an even more convoluted way? Everyone can agree that the PC version of Stardew Valley is an indie project made by one person at the time. At least I hope we can agree on that. But what about the console ports? Because those were handled by a publisher and a development studio that wasn't them. So they received outside help. Does Stardew then live in a world where only the PC version is an indie title, but the console versions weren't? If so, then did those console versions become indie games again after Concerned Apes split with Chucklefish for these ports and started handling them internally? Hopefully these examples help explain my point that indie games and labeling games as indie is just a convoluted mess. Unless you were on the money route for defining the genre, which I guess can be okay from time to time, but it doesn't really mean anything when we talk about the independent part of independent games. Now, if you're still watching this video now, you're either more confused about what an indie game is now than when we started the video, or you've been steadfastly telling me how wrong I am about everything that I've said, and that indie games are super easy to define, and that's why that there's never ever been a controversy about what an indie game is. Quick question though. When did Minecraft stop being an indie game? Is it still an indie game? I mean, it started as an indie game. I don't know. But I guess it's time to give you my own personal thoughts. I don't think that there's any real way to stay truly independent while taking money or resources from outside groups. That could be a publisher providing funding for a game, a studio providing resources or equipment, a venture capitalist firm trying to make a quick buck off your product. In the end, once you receive some support from an outside help, you are in some way beholden to them. And if you fail to make that money back, it's no longer just you who gets hurt. And that's why out of all of these games on this list, I would personally vote for Sea of Stars to win, because in my eyes, there's nothing independent about a publisher, even an indie publisher. And that also ignores the fact that the only real reason that games have an indie label right now is basically just a marketing ploy to get their names out there as not being associated with big games. And that doesn't really mean anything if those big game publishers just start co-opting everything about that style and label in order to sell their own games, does it? I guess a better question is, do we even need a standalone indie category for games? And personally, I would probably say that we don't. So yeah, those are my standalone thoughts on a fairly confusing part of the gaming industry. And we didn't even get into the other labels, which is indie, triple I studio teams, which are big indie teams, still indie, but triple I. That would be Larian in this case. Double A, triple A, quadruple A, triple A plus. So many different labels that the industry has tried to use. So yeah, and I'm sorry about the last few weeks. I had some throat problems and had to have a tooth extracted due to infection and failed stuff. And I don't get numb at the dentist, so it's been a whole thing. I took the last week to recover and give myself some time, and I'm hoping to jump right back into videos and streams, but it might be a little slow on the startup here. Sorry. Here are the people that make these videos possible, and I'd like to thank you very much for watching. Here's a video that you might enjoy. Good day.